flight is sitting there on the counter. It just overheated. And, you know, things were apparently just setting statically. They build up so much heat that it relies on flying through the air to stay cool. And, and you know, so you build these things and they send them to Mars, and you just have all these little bitty things. So maybe it'll cool down long enough in a little while. But it actually flies pretty good in the house. I've without the shroud on. But hey, good morning, Dr. Mattmann. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Senator Holland, Senator Roger, how are you doing this morning?
You can call me Roger. I'll call you Chris if you like. It's I actually have a hard time saying your last name. I want to say Mattmann, but I think it's Mattmann, right? Or
yeah. I mean, that's close enough. Just don't call me Batman. People have called me that. So,
but does it rhyme with Batman?
You know, I've heard it all.
Okay.
Well, it's Mattmann or Mattmann. That's either one is
Mattmann. Okay.
Correct.
Good. All right. Well, Chris, you know something. Hey, once again, thanks for doing this. I've done my homework. I have a little bit of paperwork here for my cheat sheet.
Oh,
work off of, because I don't want to be too much the neophyte when we start talking about this stuff. But
I doubt it.
I think the biggest thing to start off with was that we're beyond the expected lifespan of the Ingenuity right now. It was going to last for 30 days. And like they're giving it another 30-day window. And I don't even have the exact end date for that. So if you want to talk about that, about, 30 days and 30 days, and maybe when do we have an end date that we're going to be shooting for, that they know it's going to stop flying?
So all fantastic points. So yes, so the Ingenuity helicopter that went along with 2020 Perseverance, the Mars rover, its initial goal was to be a technology demonstration. And so, running on this helicopter is a new type of high performance computing processor, the Qualcomm Snapdragon. We don't normally do that. What's running on these amazing, powerful beasts and, space assets and surface assets are typically older processors. But because Ingenuity was a tech demonstration, we were able to try new things. But yes, as you mentioned, Roger, it's beyond the technology demonstration, which was 6 flights, and we called it a month of Ingenuity, that we just completed. And so we were beyond the 6 flights, and in between the cusp of the 5th and the 6th flight, NASA did something that we've done a lot, which is basically, declare an extended mission. And they even decided that there was a new purpose for the mission for Ingenuity. It's not just a technology demonstration. And in that month of Ingenuity, the Wright brothers moment, lifting off, the second flight, lifting to a higher, elevation, making some maneuvers, all the way to the 5th flight, really going out, much farther ahead than the rover and scouting, things out. They've decided that that is a useful, beyond a useful technology demonstration, that it actually can contribute to the core science mission. And so, yes, they repurposed Ingenuity, the helicopter. It is now, extended beyond life mission. It is now part of the Mars 2020 rover Perseverance operational and science mission. It has been extended for 30 days with no end date, in sight. And I think we're right about to hit that, first 30. There is not an end date on it. It will contribute to the Perseverance mission as long as it's going and as long as it's able.
And so, like, just as a retrospect, the Spirit and the Opportunity, the Mars rovers, the Spirit ran till like 2010. I'm doing my homework. And the Opportunity ran 15 years past its landing date. And I think it just stopped working in 2018. And maybe a dust storm took it out or something like that. It covered the solar arrays or something. So you never know when something like that might happen you might get a windstorm and blow the Ingenuity over. And it's pretty much game over at that point.
Yes, because, and so the key thing, to note about Ingenuity is it is solar powered. It does have solar arrays on top. If it ever were to kind of like be blown over by a dust storm or things like that, which is possible, yes, at that point it would be, game over, because it wouldn't be able to charge, itself. And so, yeah, the Spirit and the Opportunity rovers sent in 2003, 2004 were twin rovers. Just to kind of size them, Perseverance is about the size of a Volkswagen Bug. It's very similar to Mars Science Laboratory, the 2012 Curiosity rover. Those are, car-sized rovers. Spirit and Opportunity were more kind of like mountain bike size rovers, those types of things. Maybe a couple mountain bikes is how I would, estimate them. And on those, they were solar powered. And so, yes, but they had a very long extended mission, both of those rovers, like you said, even including a decade beyond its operational 90 days, which is all it was supposed to run for in both cases. And what eventually got them was the dust storms covering the solar panels to the point of where it couldn't charge anymore. Yep.
Could they be more like Barbie Jeep sized? Is that about the size?
My middle son Heath has a Jurassic Park Jeep, and so if you're a fan of absolutely, yep, Roger.
I had girls. I have girls, and so we have Barbie Jeeps.
I love it.
Barbie Jeeps 20 years ago.
Hey, lots of horsepower in those, anyways, and cuteness.
But then also, so now the other problem is like the Perseverance is just rolling around over there, and the Ingenuity flying. And Ingenuity can fly like 8 miles an hour, and the Perseverance just rolling around. But the Perseverance has its job; it's got to move on and do. And the Ingenuity, although it's getting all the PR right now, the Ingenuity was just this technology demonstration, and the Perseverance got its job. And sooner or later, it's literally going to outrun the Ingenuity, I think, because of maybe the charge cycles on the Ingenuity. But if I understand correctly, y'all are keeping the Perseverance right there right now because it's really interesting area it's in. There's a lot of stuff to look at. But sooner or later, the rover is going to have to run off and do its duty, right?
Yeah, so right now, 2020, Roger and Perseverance are doing, it's begun its science mission. It's begun to drive and, look for science targets, run its experiments. It has a number of instruments on it, including MOXIE, which is an attempt to generate, oxygen, from, the atmosphere on Mars. It's got Sherlock, which includes hyperspectral elements and so on and so forth, and an associated camera called Watson. It's got all the, other instruments. So it has begun its science mission at this point. And so what they're using Ingenuity for as part of that core science mission is really scout ahead. So right now, some of the challenges just, and this is true in general, is, first off, there's a thin pipe from Earth to Mars, 14-minute at least round trip light time to send a message there, get something back. So very thin pipe. And so traditionally Mars rover tactical operations in which they, a bunch of very smart people, it's almost like a military sense. They get together, they do tactical rover planning. So they sit there and they look at images, about a couple hundred images from what the rover saw the last day to plan interesting science targets, rock selection, experiment selection, what to do on the surface the next day. And so limited to mast cam, nav cam, which are the, kind of like the robotic cameras. That's the mast cam that looks kind of like that short circuit robot, the cameras on that. And the nav cams, which are by the wheels and so forth. If you're only limited to that, I mean, we've done great planning. We do great science, all of that, the US, the world, NASA, we do that. But what Ingenuity is providing them is that overhead look as well and scout ahead. It has cameras on it. If it flies up to a particular elevation, it's taking topographic, data and so on and so forth. That helps them. It is now being integrated into the rover operations planning, where to go, science targets and things like that. So it will do that as long as it can. And again, that could be, 300 more days. We hope it could be 10 more years, so it depends. So yeah. And so we do have operations to try and keep Ingenuity. We have procedures in which it could, be made safe or protected if we know that wind is coming or things like that. But again, we're limited by light time and what we know about the surface of Mars, which is, we have all these great satellites that tell us about Mars writ large, but really what we're talking about there is localized, surface weather or things like that.
So, and I understand that it hasn't been totally bug-free, that it's had at least one or twice where it wouldn't go into flight mode. And I guess you guys go through the motions of reinitiating or something like that. But you literally couldn't get the blades to start spinning on it or something like that once or twice before flight.
Yes, and that did happen. And luckily, the thing, that we tell people is it's all about graceful degradation. So one version of those things happening is that, things don't start up and they never start up again. Actually there was an anomaly that happened during a flight on its way to landing, that had to do really with, when the helicopter is flying, it has topographic, data that it's collecting, and it has imaging cameras looking down. And so part of that is what it needs to do its sort of baseline configuration and decide where it is, kind of like a local version of GPS and where it's flying. And if it has some anomaly in that, it affects, its ability to land or know where it is. So we did have an anomaly, but it did in some ways battle test, our assumptions of the software, because we were able to land okay, and it was able to gracefully degrade, and things like that. We still got the data. We got engineering data about it that tell us, what was happening. And some things you can't simulate, on Earth. A lot of it we can, but some things, you can't. And so these are critical things that will tell us, from this initial demonstration, now part of the science mission, how to build fleets, of these helicopters in the future. And it gives us all that, encouragement and belief that we can do that,
That was the second anomaly I was going to talk about, and I read up on it a little bit, where so it actually helps to stabilize its flight path and all by always looking down, taking like a bunch of shots every second, and it compares what it sees in this shot to what it sees in that shot, what it sees in that shot, and apparently it skipped a frame.
Right.
And the timestamp got screwed up on it, and I could grab my little drone and show. Then it looks like the rover just kind of wobbling. And then just before it came time to land, it kind of disregards the look down camera a little bit as far as for all this stuff. It stabilizes the flight and brings it down flat. And then I heard this was just a whole learning opportunity also on how to better prepare the rover or the Ingenuity for the future of the Ingenuity for overcoming that kind of problem.
Roger, that's exactly right. And I've been doing a lot of Clubhouse rooms, Clubhouse social media app, audio only, drop-in audio, and with NASA's chief scientist, Dr. Jim Green. And Jim talks about this, and things like that. And exactly like you said, Roger, it's a learning opportunity. We fully intend to get more missions with more helicopters and things like that. Jim wants to fly a helicopter into lava tubes and basically, see what's going on, there. And Ingenuity is not the end, it's the first. We're learning every day from it, and we'll continue to do that, and we're happy it's still here, and it's given us great science. And it's really, and this is important for the folks listening in Alaska and everywhere else, it is not a toy anymore, and it's not just a media toolkit or a press thing. It is contributing to the 2020 core rover planning and science mission. So
I tell you, that absolutely amazes me, because I have my little drone and I fly it around my yard, fly it through the trees, and I cannot fly with the camera, with looking through the drone, because I hear dogs can't see in 3 dimensions, or dogs can't see a 2-dimensional thing. That's why they can't see a TV screen. I don't believe that's true. I think I've seen my dog watching TV.
There's a lot of things that people say that that's the whole point. It's a hypothesis, right? So
but looking at this 2-dimensional screen and trying to fly my rover through the trees, I find very challenging. But I guess even the Ingenuity has 3-dimensional, then has stereo vision forward as well as down.
Yes.
So it can kind of wobble between those two photos and get an idea of how close an object is. Does it have any kind of radar, where it has a sensor or is it mostly just using optical?
It's optical imagery. Yep. And so just for the audience, so they know what we're talking about, different types of science instruments. Radar is basically bouncing a light beam, looking at the backscatter once it hits an object from that to determine things like typically distance and so on and so forth. And then when we say optical, we're talking about what our eyes can see in imagery, related to that, and instruments that measure it. And so, yes, it's optical, on the Ingenuity helicopter right now. And part of that is like, well, why didn't you put, 52 instruments on it? And as you know this, Roger, but, it's important for the people of Alaska. We'd love to, but there's, limited payload, and, it's a trade-off between payload and mass and what we could get up there, and all of those things. So.
Well, Philip was running the video earlier that showed 100,000 feet of altitude simulated on Earth. if you're going to try to fly the Ingenuity on Earth in its current Mars environment, you got to go up to 100,000 feet. When you think about it, I believe Everest is 29,000 feet, and there are not many helicopters that can get to the top of Everest. And then you're talking about, 100,000 feet up above that. I really see it as being really challenging. It's amazing. This little rover here will fly for 30 minutes on a charge, and the blades are teeny tiny. It's got four of them though. The Ingenuity, the sensor package, the battery package it's not that small. I mean, but the blades are I believe 4 feet long. It's got 2 counter rotating blades.
Yep.
And it can only fly for like a minute 20 or something like that. So I'm guessing that it will be a while before we figure out. We're going to really have to have some great battery technology or something like that to really lighten the load before we get into really distance flying helicopters, huh?
100%, Roger. And so, sometimes people, ask me, or they ask us in the space community, or, they make the kind of comparison. It's like, why are we doing XYZ in space? Why aren't we doing things here on Earth? And, there's some merit to some of those statements. But one thing I tell people is every dollar invested in space comes back to you tenfold, for Earth. And as an example, to the point that you just made, we need better power, battery sources, advances in that. Okay, NASA is working on that. We will be doing that, and you just named a great use case. We got a minute and a half, on Ingenuity, it's done. And then it takes hours to recharge, right? And so on and so forth, because it's got to, it's got to downlink its comm, to Perseverance. So imagine that it's tethered to Perseverance. It's not like Ingenuity is sending up to a satellite and then coming back down to Perseverance. It's tethered to Perseverance. So it's sending directly, to it. So it's still got to do all that after the flight, and its lasting charge and things like that. But regardless, we need, better and more advanced battery technology. So every dollar spent on NASA to do that, where could it possibly come back to us on Earth? Smart cars, electric cars, advanced batteries and energy sources, to power grid, electrical grid, which are different sources of energy. So those are all, just again in the sort of supply chain circle of life, every dollar spent on space, I just want everyone to remember that it comes back, tenfold, on Earth. So
yeah, was Tang invented for the space program?
I heard a rumor.
The orange drink Tang. For some reason, it makes me think of that. So the first place that the Ingenuity, when it was on Mars, you guys, I think y'all paid tribute to the Wright brothers, and y'all called the first landing area that Ingenuity took off and landed several times. And I have a note down here. It was called like the Wright Brothers Field. Y'all called that little landing spot the Wright Brothers Field, correct?
Yep. We name targets on Mars because, just like naming an asteroid or a comet or things like that, NASA has named places, of significance or targets or science targets or just targets of significance on Mars. And we did call it the Wright Brothers Field in, honor of the Wright brothers who had the first moment of flight, here on Earth. And so, yes, and that's absolutely true.
And that was what the Ingenuity was all about, the first powered flight on another world. Can we do it, right?
100%. And Ingenuity was born really out of a lot of people at JPL and Caltech, but we have to give a lot of credit to the prior director of JPL, Charles Lalachi, and we have to give a lot of credit to NASA's former director of planetary science and now chief scientist, Jim Green. And Jim tells the story kind of like this, and I saw some of this at JPL during my time, but unconvinced 10 years ago, during 2020 that we should do this, you should spend 20, 30, 40, however many millions of dollars to do this. And NASA by itself is very risk averse. It's not SpaceX in terms of a risk profile, just as an example. Why is that? Well, NASA crashes something, loss of life, God forbid, or anything else. There's a congressional hearing. The commercial industry do that, and there might be a congressional hearing, but it doesn't have to, always be. And depending on it, they have a little bit more flexibility and risk profile. And so for us to have NASA be convinced that we should do that technology demonstration, that we should do it, heavily involved Charles Ilachi, heavily involved Jim Green, and a lot of very senior people. And so just looking at Mimi Ong, the project manager who's been involved, you know, in Ingenuity the whole time since the beginning, watching Teddy Kazillos, who's, you know, who was a former drone racer, you know, it came from that, and he came to JPL, you know, from that, and just to watch the whole team, you know, witness their moment, you know, watch that happen over the last decade was really big.
And just to remind people, if you've never seen drone racers, just Google a drone race YouTube, and it is crazy fun to watch. They have fluorescent hoops and concrete tubes, and these guys are flying with the VR, the virtual reality headsets on, and it's crazy to watch 4 drones screaming through this landscape, and the crashes can be very dramatic sometimes. But so somebody lost their imaginative output, because then the second flight became Airfield B, and the next flight became Airfield C. I mean, you know, they could have maybe just tweaked that a little bit, but that's okay.
Hey,
okay.
maybe Roger, in the future they'll do something with crypto related to it. I sense a marketing, you know, scheme there, or you know, some type of value extract or notoriety. You know, it's like, you know, maybe we'll send some crypto, or you could, you know, get your name on Mars. I don't know.
I was thinking marketing, but I'm afraid to mention a product right now. But you know, like the XYZ bubblegum field, like they do with the stadiums. Or,
oh yeah, or United presents
yeah,
the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, you know, which is
who knows
you know,
what? Who knows
close
what?
to me.
But also a tip of the hat to the Wright brothers. And you might have even mentioned this before the last time we spoke, but there's apparently a little bit of material from the first Wright flyer. I can't remember. I forget what the name of the first plane was that the Wrights flew.
I forget the name of the plane too, but I know it happened at Kitty Hawk, you know, but
yeah, but they have a little bit of like the skin off of the plane that somehow they managed to affix to the Ingenuity. So as it's flying around up there on Mars, it's got a little bit of history with it.
that's right, Roger. And you know, if I could tell you, JPL and NASA are superstitious. We all are. And you know, for anyone that will visit JPL in the future, and I hope, you know, you will, you know, amongst other folks, you heard that here. So from even before we send something, you know, to another planet or orbiting it or the surface, we start out superstitious. So there's this notion of the lucky peanuts, you know, and before we land and we do EDL, we, you know, the story goes is, you know, if we didn't eat our lucky peanuts, you know, we've had some anomalies or bad things happen in the past with the 2009 Mars Climate Orbiter or things like that. And so now every day we, you know, I'm sorry, every mission or EDL that you'll see them popping the peanuts, you know, the lucky peanuts, because every time we've popped those peanuts and we've eaten them, we've been successful. And so we're superstitious. We also like to put Easter eggs, you know, on things. So, you know, one of them, like you said, for Ingenuity, it's got a piece of the Wright brothers, you know, and it, you know, this dates back to Voyager, you know, the golden record, you know, and things like that, in which, you know, we put basically signs of the human race in, you know, the media at the time, you know, our music, our language, and we put it on record, and it's part of this thing as it goes out into interstellar space. If it encounters anything, they'll have something, you know, about us. And the last thing I'll tell you about is the wheels of the 2012 Curiosity rover. You know, as the rumor goes, one of the things is we wanted the wheels when it was driving to spell out on the ground JPL. Some people thought that was a little too overt. And so JPL, being the JPLers that we are, we didn't put JPL, but we sure did put in Morse code JPL. So now when it makes those tracks, it's making tracks in Morse code that say JPL on it. So Easter egg, superstition, it's an interesting novel. So
for anybody who doesn't know what an Easter egg is like a small item or something with hidden meaning. A lot of times you're watching movies, and movies may have Easter eggs. Like the whole Marvel series, there was all these Easter eggs that related to things that weren't in the movies. Or, I mean, and also if you happen to be a fan of Deadpool, that one's just crazy full of Easter eggs. But and so really the tread on the tires of the rover is JPL in Morse code. So as it's rolling, it's typing out Morse code JPL across the Martian surface.
Absolutely. And that was on the 2012 Curiosity MSL rover. And I've given too many of these tours of JPL, where we tell people this. So you're getting the live tour now. So
somebody spent a lot of time, I think, planning the position of the ridges in a round tire to do that. But hey, so Philip, do we have anybody with any questions? I don't want to be obligated, but honestly,
we do. We have so one of the questions is just has to do with Dr. Mattmann and what he does at NASA's JPL.
Yeah. And so thank you for that question. I am the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at NASA JPL. I've been there for about 20 years, the first 10 of which I spent as the Chief Architect in the Instrument and Science Data Systems Division. And so we were basically building the software that takes the data when it comes down to the ground from an Earth or a planetary science mission and processes it, takes the engineering, the raw data, and it turns it into images for the public, information for decision makers and things like that, and so on and so forth. And so my first 10 years were spent doing that, and I learned a lot about Earth and planetary science and worked with scientists and so forth. And in my latter 10 years, I did technology program development, working a lot with the Department of Defense, getting technology dollars and figuring out how to infuse that into space. In the last 5 years, I've been in the Information Technology Directorate as the Deputy CTO and now the CTIO. So yeah, what do? We do AI, analytics, innovation. We help the roboticists with new technologies and ideas, try and automate things, try and dare mighty things. So
there's a line, so maybe I watch too much TV, but there's a line from Armageddon where Bruce Willis looks at I can't remember his name, the guy who's actually from NASA says, you guys, you just sit around and think of things and you only got this for your plan. So yeah, I guess you guys just sit around and think of things, right?
We do a lot of sitting. We do a lot of sitting around and thinking of things for sure. But one thing we do is an awful lot of doing too. And so one thing I can say is that JPL as a whole, 66 plus 100, people, in terms of personnel and even greater, including all of our affiliates and contractors. They're amazing people. One thing I can tell you is every person on my team, wakes up and grinds every day, and they're very happy to be contributing to these amazing missions and projects.
Now, are y'all seeing any, so I'm also in the Coast Guard Auxiliary. The Coast Guard Auxiliary is a volunteer uniform branch of the Coast Guard. And they had us involved in, and this might be nothing at all that you're involved in, but more the question is, so I can't remember, it's like mini cubes, or there's like these tiny CubeSats or something. And there's a receiving station, I believe, up in Fairbanks that one of our auxiliaries went up and helped work on it. But is it more that we're trying to get what we're sending out into space smaller and simpler to make it like more resilient to problems in the field, to make it easier to get out there? Or because it still seems to me like the Perseverance, being the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, that's a pretty hefty device that we're shipping out there. And the Ingenuity, like you said, a lot of thought was invested in the Ingenuity. A lot of money was invested in this pure technology demo, and to see if it works up there. But it seems like the Perseverance was a very large device that we're shipping out there. Or is it? Are y'all seeing that y'all also trying to go small?
Yeah, it's great. It's great, Roger. So let me unpack that. There's a lot in there. So first, the Alaska SAR facility and the Alaska ground station is an amazing asset to the nation. To get data downlinked, not in deep space, but at least in near orbit, LEO, GEO, and even lunar, we have these facilities around the world, these downlink facilities. And what that allows us to do is to take data from out of the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, into space, and downlink it to the ground. And so we need, and in a high bandwidth type of way, and we, these are all radio frequency facilities today. In the future, they'll be optical. They use light, to basically send an RF radio frequency as a form of light, but it's slower than optical. You could differentiate it in your mind with the difference, say, with a cable modem at your home internet versus, say, fiber or optical. And so these great facilities, including Alaska SAR and all of that, they're around. And so what are we talking about here? We're talking about the movement from big, large payloads, or what we call flagship missions, into this sort of new economy that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years with small sats, CubeSats. What are those? These are, in some cases, shoebox, multi-shoebox size, basically instruments, spacecraft, computers that we ship up into space, typically in increasing number or large quantities. And commercial industry is really driving this, at the moment, as well as academia. Before 20, 30 years ago, the only folks that could launch anything into space and be successful were nation states, were the Department of Defense, the military, civilian agencies like NASA, and so on and so forth. Today, that's not so true because we've commercialized both the launch, the building, we've developed business partnerships with academia and industry, and now space is becoming increasingly accessible, especially in near Earth, to be able to build an instrument for low cost, build a spacecraft for low cost, and then get a lift to put these things in or around Earth's orbit. And so in Earth, or for Earth types of things, we're seeing an increase. I mean, we're talking today, there are maybe 250 plus NASA Earth science missions in operation. That's just NASA. Maybe, add hundreds if you include the Department of Defense and other, things. Each nation state might multiply that by the top 10 by 10. So what are we talking about? We're talking about thousands of typically bigger size assets. And I didn't even include the small sats, CubeSats. In the next 5 years, the estimates are tens of thousands to potentially hundreds of thousands of these smaller CubeSat devices. And so we can really say that we are in a new age of space with respect to that. Now we talk about Mars. Why do we send these big things to Mars? Well, to get the lift to Mars, sometimes we got to wait 2 years for everything to be aligned with current propulsion and all of that. So we don't get many lifts, to Mars and, basically agency to kind of put things there. So when we do, we typically do a mass payload trade-off balance. And because we don't get many lifts, we want to put a lot, on there. And so we're going to put a lot of instrumentation on there to do that. And so that's part of the reason that we do what you talk about. It's why Perseverance is big, and things like that. In the future, let me just say 1 ton, Perseverance is about 1 ton class size rover. If we want to have humans on Mars by 2030s, in the 2035, we need to put 40 tons of payload on Mars. That is an order of magnitude increase. How are we going to do that? Well, we need food, supplies, maker utilities, the ability to convert Mars, materials into things and build and air and all these things. Oxygen. So how are we going to get to 40? Well, it's not going to happen in one shot. We're going to send multiple missions. Maybe we can do 10 per mission, 4 missions, 10. How are we going to even do 10? That's still an order of magnitude. Well, we got a decade, let's get there.
I've often thought that I would love to volunteer to go to Mars, but you guys would have to send at least 5 Walmarts ahead of me. There's like 5 Walmarts, and I haven't seen the oxygen section at Walmart yet. So there's a problem there. We'll have to figure out how we're going to get the oxygen over there. But I think it'd be, great, even a one-way trip. You reach a certain point in life, a certain age, and you realize, you're starting to worry about, are your pet's going to outlast you? So, to go to Mars, that'd be crazy.
Roger's a pop culture fan, and so I'll make a quick pop culture joke. I'm reminded of President Scrooge from Spaceballs. So, and for your audience, anyone knows what I'm talking about, they'll figure it out. Watch that movie. Air is bottled or canned in that movie. So,
well, so you mentioned like one versus like the new shoebox and CubeSats and small sats and all. Because used to be we would put literally one satellite in one rocket and lift it off. And now they are putting dozens. You take all these CubeSats and you stack them inside there, and you can send up a dozen or dozens actually for the same payload cost that one satellite used to do. And that's why the near Earth stuff is going so small because you can get a lot more for the bang, right?
That's exactly right, Roger. And a lot of people ask me, and maybe they ask you too, but what is the big deal with space junk? Why are people worried so bad about space junk or space traffic management? It's precisely the reason. With 100,000, I mean, space is big. It's like, it feels like, even the space between Leo, Geo, and the moon and Earth is like much bigger than we think about. So it's not like suddenly we're going to put up 100,000 of these things and then you won't be able to see the Earth anymore. That said, because in the vertical profile of this, it's so big and vast, but still, you have to have orbits, the Earth is orbiting and all of that. You have to do space traffic management, and at a level that they haven't had to do before. And now it's this multi-functioning, governing, coordinating body that, previously included, say, Department of Defense, civilian agencies and things like that. And again, that's just in the US, now add in other nation states and all of that. But commercial industry is driving this now. So Elon and SpaceX, they put up Starlink. It's a great purpose. It's to provide, internet in very high broadband internet in places that are very hard to kind of physically build that infrastructure on Earth. And it beams it to people's, homes, which is great. The problem is with so many thousands of these Starlinks, and the lack of, I would say, greatly coordinated space traffic management, there have been some issues, related to that. And these are some of the problems that we got to think about.
You're getting back to pop culture, Gravity, the movie Gravity with George Clooney and Sandra Bullock, and they're out there on one of the shuttles just doing a thing on a satellite, and apparently something else happens. Two satellites bump and creates a debris field, and as they're passing through the debris field, just everything goes wrong. Everything's disintegrated, and like every 90 minutes, they're going around the Earth and they're going right back through that debris field. And I remember 20, 30 years ago, they were talking about how much junk there was up in space and the danger of things passing through it. But let's get back to Mars real quick. So you had mentioned the Ingenuity and the Perseverance. And one thing is, if the Ingenuity ever does get out of range, like the 1 kilometer, whatever the range is for the Ingenuity, then we literally can't even send it the instructions to wake up and go do a job, right? That could be the problem. If it ever gets out of range of the Perseverance, then that also could be when its life is going to end. This thing doesn't do things on its own. It's still got to be told to do stuff, right?
That's exactly right, Roger. You can imagine in your mind a virtual kilometer-based tether between the rover and it. And it doesn't have other comms to, like, again, go up to a satellite and then come back down to the rover. Its comm parent, its communications parent is the rover. So it needs to stay in that, I'll call it, because I'm a big fan of Oculus and AR, VR, that kilometer guardian, around it. It's got to be in that. And that's its tether to the rover.
Well, Philip, are there any other questions popping up? And you can look for the question, and I'll pose this to Dr. Mattmann. I think the whole world wants to know, what is it with ceramic birdhouses? Is full of ceramic birdhouses.
I haven't been on the Rate My Room yet, or the Room Rater thing and all that. But I need to get some props from the Room Rater. My wife is an amazing decorator. These are a particular type of ceramic. If I flipped my camera around, so in the pandemic, like many people, I did the natural thing. I took over the dining room. So actually, I'm in the dining room. I've been there, and I've turned it. I have an innovation lab at JPL that I haven't been able to touch in, since March 20. I don't even know how many months that is. So I rebuilt a little mini version of it here in my dining room, and so this is our buffet. There are these ceramics all around, cups and these birdhouses. This is a Ray Dunn. It's a type of ceramic. It's known for its lettering, and they're on coffee mugs. They're on T-shirts. We love them. So.
I say at first glance, also the background there, it kind of looks like a hazmat room. It kind of looks like you have like bioplastic up there, but then I realized that's probably curtains, right? So,
those are curtains.
All right.
Philip,
Question? I have a couple questions. So they're not related to Mars, but I know that you do other things outside of Mars. And I just wanted to, so currently you guys are doing, I'll just give you both questions. You can kind of go over them. The Moon rover, I know that it's coming out. And then also something about Venus. And I would want to know why you're excited about Venus.
You got it.
Rover, the one's going to pick up the samples, or is there even another new rover?
So we have a program called Artemis, and Artemis, the goal is to get kind of like a moon base, or, a moon launching pad or something in L2 that we don't have to get out of the Earth's atmosphere in order to, say, launch things. If, one of the hardest parts about, getting to Mars is we need a big Atlas V, rocket or something just to get out of the Earth's atmosphere and to get this payload out into space and then get it on its way. But what if in the future we could imagine through this Artemis program having some type of launch capability from the moon? And that's the context of the Artemis. And so the moon became the focus of attention during the last administration. And one positive thing I could say is, as opposed to the pendulum swift between administrations that we experience sometimes, especially in space, this administration has decided, and I applaud them, to continue with the Artemis program and to keep that, building that capability in the moon and getting to Mars for that. And so one of the components of that is a rover type of capabilities on the moon. Why? First, technology demonstration and a proving ground for future Mars rovers. The moon is similar in some of the types of things that we would do with a rover, so we can prove it out and test it. And so that's one of the reasons for that. And then, all of this is to support eventual human exploration of Mars and getting to Mars and having the capacity, infrastructure, and technological capabilities, again, to have a non-Earth-based launch type of capability from Moon or L2. So that's part one. Part two, Venus. Why? Venus is a very interesting, sister planet to Earth. And so the mission you're talking about is that it was recently announced, and I think it was 2 Discovery Awards, and one of them was called Veritas, at JPL, and that's a mission to explore the upper atmosphere of Venus. The upper atmosphere of Venus, actually, I won't say it's habitable, but it's not like the planet of Venus, which basically the way I would describe it is fire and brimstone, or Mordor, if you're in my pop culture way, from the Lord of the Rings.
Lots of acids, sulfuric acids, and hostile environments. And
you nailed it, Roger. And so, not only when landing on Venus would you, implode within 30 seconds, but while doing it, you'd catch on fire. And so actually we have, examples of this. During the 70s, the Soviets had the Venera missions. And they actually, you can Google Soviets, Venera missions. We do have images from the surface of Venus. What happened in these, I think 6 missions that they went, is they were able to get a lander on Venus. Again, it maybe had 30 minutes of life, on it to be able to take some images and then send those back before, again, it imploded and burst into flames. And so you can look it up. I don't have pictures of it bursting into flames, but I'm just imagining that in my head. But so anyways, you can see it, and it pretty much looks like, fire and brimstone. So why are we studying Venus or whatever? The upper atmosphere of Venus has been a target for things like atmospheric balloons, for, further study of these gaseous systems, for study of, its topography and actually how the planet has evolved and got to that point. These are important things for us to know on Earth, similar to looking at Mars too, because it speaks to planetary evolution and how, these things, which conceivably were a lot more Earth-like, potentially hundreds of millions of years ago, got to, the point at which they are today. And so we are going to have Veritas, which again is a satellite orbiter of Venus that will explore Venus's atmosphere and other, atmospheric parameters associated with that. And so that's why we're doing that. And a number of us are very excited about Veritas, because a lot of times people say, why only Mars, why this or that? There are other planets that we should be studying. And so I'm excited because, again, the last things that you could see about Venus, literally we're talking like the 70s, early 80s. It's been quite a while. So
I'm sorry. I just wanted to, one last thing I was wanting to cover is Senator Holland had brought it up, is the final next phase of the Mars mission. Currently you have Perseverance, where it's actually like breaking rocks and things like that. And then you have another, like a whole nother missions coming next. And so I just wanted to go into that a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, 100%, Philip and Roger. So Mars 2020 Perseverance and Ingenuity are part of a multi-phased set of Mars missions with the ultimate goal of proving that we can return samples from Mars. How are we going to do that, and what is involved? So the next phase of the project, which has already started, is called Mars Sample Return. And the basic concept is this: just like you said, Philip, 2020 Perseverance is boring rocks. It's leaving these bored rocks in tubules, analogous, maybe the size of a few iPhones or something like that. And it's going to leave these bored rocks in these tubules, and it's going to plant them over its multi-year mission. And what's happening between now and then is that we're building a capability called the Fetch rover. The Fetch rover's goal, when it's launched as part of Mars sample return, along with a Mars orbiter and a rendezvous point, will be for the Fetch rover to basically retrace and track 2020's tubules that it planted and drive farther and faster with more autonomy. And its goal will be to collect those tubules, to rendezvous, at a rendezvous point, to blast those tubules up in a, from a lander itself back out of the Martian atmosphere and into space, and then fly those tubules back to Earth, of rocks. And so that whole multi-phase mission is part of the Mars sample return program. And again, I'm really excited about it because autonomy has to advance, because again, this rover is going to have to drive a lot. It's going to be more of kind of like a bicycle or multi-bicycle type rover again, and it's going to have to drive farther and faster than we've ever had before to collect all those to that rendezvous spot. And again, like blasting stuff off from the surface of Mars and showing that we can get it back will give us confidence someday that we can do that with humans. And it's not immediately clear that that'll be necessary for the first humans. There's discussions about if that's a one-way trip for them to start a new colony or whatever, but it's good to know if we did have the capability to, again, get some rocks back, and not just for geological study, but to prove out the end-to-end capability for doing that. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a lot of planning, a lot of work that has been. At some point, you guys might think it's easier to send 5 Walmarts and 1 senator to just go and do this job. All you got to do is walk around there, pick up tubes, and stick them in a basket, and put them in a rocket, and send them back up. So, at some point, you guys might think about that.
Well, I'm immediately starting a project now on that, Roger.
Yeah, good luck with that. Better do it quick. So, Philip. Any more questions?
No, there's one last question was just how you're going to get the samples back from Mars. Like how do they actually get back to Earth?
So part of Mars sample return is a multi-phased set of components, spacecraft, lander, and rover. The Fetch rover's goal, collect those samples. The lander's goal will be the rendezvous point for the Fetch rover to rendezvous. And this is going to happen over years. So it's not like the Fetch rover is going to be able to drive like a car and do all, span these, potentially hundreds of miles, or hundreds of kilometers in one, day or a week or whatever. This is going to happen over years, but it's going to collect those. It's going to get to that, rendezvous lander. That lander will have a capability to blast back off and get up into the atmosphere. And there will be an orbiter there as well, waiting for that lander to get up out of the Martian atmosphere, bring it those tubules, and it will have the capability to basically from space, from Mars, fly back to Earth. So it will have, itself thrust and, the ability to do that. So that whole process will take years, and basically we're laying the framework now over the next 4 to 6 years to launch the components of that, get them to Mars, and start to do those retrieve operations. And so the how is being figured out really over the next decade, to do that.
So Mars is a planet. How big is it? And just a quick answer, and compared to Earth, is it a little smaller than Earth?
Yes, it's smaller than Earth. The analogies I've seen are that multiple Mars could fit in an Earth, related to that.
Are we using all these rovers, and are they all pretty much like working in the same footprint on Mars, or do y'all find there's something over here on this side of the planet? Where is the opportunity and the spirit in relation to the ingenuity and the perseverance? Are they on opposite sides of the planet? Are they in the same state, in the same city? What are they?
Those are great questions, Roger. They are not necessarily on opposite sides, but they're fairly far away from each other. And in fact, Spirit and Opportunity are closer to the Chinese rover that was just launched and landed, as well. They're fairly close. Jezero Crater, where 2020 Perseverance is actually quite far away. Maybe, and this is probably a bad analogy, but, it'll give you an idea. Maybe the distance, of the United States, west to east, or something like that. So they're fairly far away from, one another. How do we pick these? It's the science targets. It's what's interesting. We've We've put, insight in places where, we observe with Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter that we believe, might be, plate tectonics similar to places that will measure Mars quakes. So, we'll land it in a place that we think we're going to get the best science value. We've put, Phoenix, Mars Phoenix, we put on one of the poles of Mars because we believe that we would measure snow ice or have the ability to, search for that. Perseverance in Jezero Crater was an ancient lake bed. And so we believe that, through its mission of basically proving whether or not there is organics or life, on Mars, or there ever was life on Mars, that Jezero was the best place to do that. And so, yeah, the way that we decide that is basically what are the goals of the mission? And then what do we know about the planet? And the planet Mars, we have both the US as well as our partners and allies have many, not many, I'd say, almost maybe a half a dozen operating satellites around Mars that are giving us very detailed surface imagery, temperature parameters, hyperspectral data, multiband data that tells us about minerals and other things, both in the atmosphere all the way down to high resolution on the surface itself. So using all of those sources and what we know about Mars now over multiple decades, even dating back to, again, Voyager or things like that, we know a lot about Mars, writ large as a planet, and we use that information to guide what types of things and where we put it on the surface.
How are we doing on time, Philip?
We're doing fantastic, sir. I just wanted to make sure that we cover up as many things as we can in the time that we have. But right now we're at, I think we're just under an hour. We got like 10 minutes left.
And also, not to spend a whole lot of time on it, but could remind me, I was really impressed in our first conversation on creating oxygen on, like, the Perseverance is going to do these little tests where it's actually going to create oxygen, which will serve as fuel and which could serve as oxygen for humans. And what is what's present on Mars that is going to let them do this? Is it, could you go over that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was just looking for the unmute button. I don't know what that noise was, but yeah. So Roger, the goal of basically the MOXIE, or the Mars Oxygen ISRU experiment, which is one of the instruments on Mars, is to take carbon dioxide, which is basically CO2, which is in the Martian atmosphere, and see if it can generate basically oxygen from it. It's not going to be like enough oxygen to power the whole planet or things like that. It's actually very modest. It's about 6 to 10 grams per hour. And it's going to try and do that at least 10 times. And again, in the whole NASA vein of things, we'll probably do it more than 10, but that's how we spec the mission or the instrument, the goals for that. To give you an idea, of what type of oxygen, the goal would be that we estimate that it needs to be at, like at least 98% pure, oxygen, which is actually quite a feat to see if we can do that. And in fact, MOXIE's been tested here on Earth. We really believe that, it's going to be able to do that. And so what it does is it actually heats the gases in the Martian atmosphere. It heats those gases and CO2, uses that heated, basically gas, and it compresses it. And so, the goal from that is then to take that compressed gas, split the carbon dioxide molecules into basically oxygen and carbon monoxide. And, from that, it can basically form, and I'm not, an expert in, chemistry or, geochemistry, but it does that. And it basically uses that to form, oxygen, from it. And so the goal is, if we can do that on a very small scale, we're going to need many of those to have humans there, because we would need to build facilities that could take the Martian atmosphere and convert it into oxygen, so that when they get inside of those, just like you saw in the Martian movie, the people can breathe. And so that's what MOXIE does.
Just so you guys know, got about 5 minutes.
I'll apologize to you. I think the beeping you heard was the controller from my rover, my drone over here. So you might have heard a beep you're trying to kill. I will apologize to the public. I usually wear hearing aids. I get through I get through the day pretty easily without them, but I don't hear high-pitched noises that well. And feminine voices drives my wife, my daughter's crazy. And you were probably hearing this high-pitched beeping over here, and I just caught a glimpse of it a little bit, and I just killed it. Sorry about that.
No worries,
That sounds like
Roger.
a really good excuse to me, honestly. Like, I don't know,
Yeah.
can't hear your wife or your daughters.
Yeah, it's selective hearing, but I have a much easier time with deeper voices, and it's kind of funny because most of the females that I work around with, like the office staff or something like that, they'll drop their voice when they talk to me, so I can hear it better. But when my hearing aids are working, I'm doing fine. I just don't have them in today. But I tell you, I think that's about. I think I've exhausted my questions. Phillips, anybody else have another question out there?
Yeah, I got one for you, Dr. Mattmann. I mean, you'd be the one that would know more than most. Is there life on Mars?
Or ice? Is there ice water on Mars?
Was it life or ice? One's easier.
Both.
I'd say both of them. Yeah.
One's easier to answer than the other. So the big question, and really I would say that the goal of the MSL Curiosity rover and 2020 is really to answer that question. And so there have been, I would say moments in which basically science has indicated to us that there might be very small organics or things on that. And it started, I think, with 2012 Curiosity and MSL, where they thought they might have seen some organics and things. And then they, basically checked it again. The only question, that we have, and we take great precautions, at JPL and NASA, is, when we send things from the Earth to Mars and we build hardware and clean rooms and stuff like that, we want to make sure that we don't contaminate it or have some sort of false, assumption that we found something, but it actually came from Earth, during that journey. And so we go to great detail to kind of protect that. In 2012, MSL Curiosity and its science mission, there was the belief, I think, and there was some news about this, that we might have found organics related to that. That is still being vetted in the scientific community. And, so I can't confirm. And what are organics? The smallest life forms and things like that, down at the molecular or, the biological level. And so are there human or gray beings or whatever walking around on Mars? We don't have any evidence of that, but are there organics? It seems like MSL Curiosity might have found something, and they're vetting that in the scientific community. So that's where that is. However, is there water? Is there ice? Is there things? Absolutely. So actually, this is kind of a pop culture thing. It's like, oh, there's no water on Mars. Actually, there is multiple missions dating back to Phoenix, dating back to other things. We know that it snows on Mars. In fact, there are publications in the American Geophysical Union that say that. We know there are riverbeds. There are river flows even still on Mars. We know that it can rain, on Mars and things like that. So there is water, there is snow, there is ice on Mars in various places, depending on the temperature conditions. And so that, it doesn't surprise me, but it almost does in a way that's not known out there, or so, even it's almost seems like an old tale, or, things like that. No, that does exist, and that has been validated by the scientific community. But as to life, that's what we're trying to find. And, there have been some promising things, but I'll leave it to the science community to debate.
Well, I just want to tell you. Oh, sorry, sir. Go ahead.
There are snow caps on the poles of Mars, correct? That expand and decrease with the seasons.
That's right, Roger. Mars is seasonal.
Like on Earth.
It's diurnal. It has a diurnal, a seasonal cycle for that. And there are seasons on Mars.
Philip, you had something?
Yeah, I just want to let you know we're closing on a minute left, and I just wanted to thank you both very much for this. Like you just mentioned, a lot of this information isn't out there for the public, and I believe that this is primarily the reason why. Is there's a lot of misinformation or old information, or out there, and it's really nice to hear it directly from the source. So thank you, Dr. Mattmann, and thank you, Senator Holland.
Chris, thanks so much. This is always fun. This is just a real blast to hear this kind of information from the inside.
Roger, it's a blast to talk science with you and Philip. You're amazing. You're a great compatriot and partner in getting the message of NASA and the science community and the space and the tech community out there. We'll do this again. Always a pleasure. Let me know. And you stay safe, and you guys just hang out. I look forward to seeing people soon. The world's opening up. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right.